On Monday morning, as the school hallways filled with laughter and the voices of students, no one paid any attention to the petite figure standing in the doorway. Her uniform was clearly worn, a torn sleeve, frayed knees, mismatched buttons. She was barefoot. In her hands she held a folded piece of paper which she clutched with such delicacy that it was the only thing in the world she didn't want to lose. It was Lena, quiet, withdrawn, always sitting in the last row. Children often ridiculed her, teachers ignored her. To most, she was simply that poor girl. That day, her appearance had provoked mocking whispers even before she entered the classroom. "Look at her clothes. She looks like she sleeps on the street," one of the boys whispered. "Why do they even let her in here?" added the girl in designer shoes. Lena heard everything, but she kept her head down. She held the letter, and she kept walking. The teacher looked at her with irritation, as if her presence was a disruption to the routine. Late, and in this condition, it's unacceptable. But Lena didn't answer. She went to the desk, put down the letter, and sat quietly in her corner. No one expected that this crumpled paper would have the power to stop the entire school. No one imagined that on that day the silence of the poor girl would be louder than all the screams. The teacher looked at the letter with distaste. This wasn't the first time Lena had brought something incomprehensible, or so it seemed. Thinking it was another plea for help, she shrugged and put the note aside. But something about the way Lena had handed it over stirred a strange sense of unease. The break started as usual. Kids ran out into the courtyard, laughter, chips, smartphones. Lena stayed in the classroom, alone. Her gaze was fixed on the floor. She didn't cry. She was too used to rejection to react with tears. At this time, the teacher, despite her internal resistance, opened the letter, and she froze. The words were written carefully, but they trembled, as if each letter were fighting for courage. In the letter, Lena described things no one expected. She wrote about her mother with cancer, about her father who had abandoned them, about how they had been sleeping together in the same bed for weeks because they couldn't afford heating, about how her torn uniform was the only school clothes she had, and about how she didn't bring breakfast because there wasn't even bread at home. But the hardest part was the ending. "I'm not writing this so you can feel sorry for me. I'm writing this because I only want one thing, to be treated like a human being." The teacher's hands trembled. Her heart began to beat faster. Something inside her broke. She felt ashamed, not just for herself but for the entire school that watched but never saw. A bell rang in the courtyard. But he wasn't the one who was going to break the routine that day. This was supposed to be the letter. The teacher could no longer sit in silence. With the letter in her hand, she headed to the teacher's room, her face expressing more than 1,000 words. As the door closed, she looked at her colleagues. Not everyone liked her, but that didn't matter at the moment. She placed the letter in the middle of the table and said one sentence that changed everything. "You have to read this. Now." Some approached reluctantly, others out of curiosity. But after a few minutes, there was a silence so thick you could hear the beating of hearts. One of the teachers, known for her strictness, covered her mouth with her hand and looked away. Another man, the sports class teacher, suddenly put down his phone and looked out the window, his eyes full of tears. At the same time, someone overheard a conversation in the corridor, and that's how it started. One whisper, then two, and then a wave that no one could stop. "I hear Lena wrote a letter. Apparently he lives without electricity. I heard there's nothing to eat." The students began to pass on this information with disbelief and a growing sense of guilt. Those who had been mocking her in the hallway moments before now felt their stomachs tighten. The girl they had treated as a shadow suddenly became a mirror, and that mirror reflected their indifference. No one knew yet what would happen, but one thing was certain. This day would be different from any other, because the whisper turned into noise, and noise into something that would stop the entire school. The principal's office was usually the place where formal matters were discussed. Attendance, achievements, complaints. But on this day, an emotional silence reigned there. When the teacher brought Lena's letter, the principal initially looked at it coldly, like at hundreds of other documents that passed across her desk. But after the first few lines, something changed. Her brows drew together, her eyes narrowed. She read more slowly, then a second time, and a third. "This was written by Lena?" she asked quietly, as if she didn't believe it. When she reached the end, she didn't say anything for a long moment. She sat down, took off her glasses, put them on the desk, and took a deep breath. In that one moment, the woman many students had considered stern and distant looked completely shaken. We failed her. We failed as a school. We failed as adults. The teachers were silent. Finally, one of them said, "We can't just leave this like this. We have to do something." The director stood up suddenly, as if a new light had awakened within her. "We'll stop classes. I'll call an assembly. Not to embarrass her, but so everyone hears this letter, so they understand." In the meantime, someone brought news from the corridors. Students began to gather, whispering, asking questions, some searching for Lena with their eyes. The girl was still sitting alone in the classroom. Little did she know that she would soon become the center of something that would change not only her life, but also the consciences of hundreds of people. The principal's voice over the school intercom sounded different than usual, soft with a hint of emotion. "I ask all students and teachers to gather in the gym. It is urgent and very important." The school, accustomed to predictable rituals, suddenly began to pulsate with a different energy. Students left their classrooms in surprise, and teachers led them away without explanation. Even the most rebellious behaved differently today. Something was in the air. Lena was asked to come to the classroom last. No one told her why. The janitor came for her with a tenderness he had never shown before. He looked at her as someone important, not as a problem. As she entered the gym, all the conversations stopped. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned to look at her, some in disbelief, others in shame. Her torn uniform, which had brought laughter in the morning, now seemed like a symbol of something bigger, something no one could ignore anymore. The director stood in the middle of the stage. She was holding a piece of paper in her hands, the same letter. "Before I read what I have in my hand, I want you all to know, there are moments that teach us more than all of our lessons combined. This is one of those moments." And she began to read. Her voice trembled, but she kept going, word by word, sentence by sentence. The room was completely silent. No one whispered. No one looked at their phone. Even the most anxious students stood still. When she reached the final sentence, "When I only want one thing, to be treated like a human being," many could no longer hold back their tears. This was no ordinary roll call. It was a lesson in humanity. When the last words of the letter rang out over the loudspeakers, for a moment no one knew what to do. Time seemed to stand still. There were no classes in that room, no groups of friends, no popular students. There were only people, and one girl who dared to speak. Lena stood to the side against the wall, hunched up as if she wanted to disappear, but she couldn't. The entire school was looking at her, not with contempt, not with laughter, with something she had never experienced before, with attention, with humility. And then, unexpectedly, one of the students, the most popular in school, the daughter of a local business owner, known for her perfect Instagram photos, approached Lena. Without a word, she took off her coat and covered the girl with it. "I didn't know. I'm sorry," she whispered. This gesture was like a fuse. Another student came up behind her, and another girl, and a teacher. Each wanted to say something, not loudly, not for applause, but quietly, truly. Someone handed her a change of shoes. Someone else took a second breakfast out of his backpack and put it next to her. One of the boys took a small keychain out of his pocket and gave it to her with a smile. "Luckily, my favorite. Now yours." Tears were streaming down not only Lena's face. The adults stood as if frozen. What was happening was not planned, it was not forced. It was a real transformation. The school, which for years looked but did not see, has finally opened its eyes. And it all started with one poor girl. And one letter. After an assembly that changed the atmosphere of the entire school, teachers gathered in the teachers' lounge. But this was no ordinary meeting. This time, it wasn't about curriculum, grades, or discipline. It was about something that had been neglected for years: humanity, empathy, and responsibility. The principal closed the door and sat down heavily in the chair, holding Lena's letter in her hand. She looked at the teaching staff without anger, but with pain. "Do you realize that this child sat in our classrooms every day, and none of us asked how he was feeling?" There was silence. No one dared to respond. One of the younger teachers, who had not spoken much up until now, raised her voice. "Maybe it's time to stop teaching only from books. Maybe we should start teaching with our hearts." These words triggered something no one expected. A storm of ideas began. Let's organize a collection of clothes and school supplies for students in need. Let's create a support fund for families in difficult situations. Let's introduce classes on empathy, tolerance, and respect. And maybe we should start with ourselves, with our reactions, with the words we use. Never before have the teachers at this school spoken with such passion. Lena, a girl whom many couldn't even name in the morning, became a symbol of change, a mirror in which they saw not only their students, but also their own mistakes. The director stood up and looked at them with new strength. Okay, from today on, this is not the same school, and I will not let what happened today be just a moment of emotion. This is supposed to be the beginning. The next day, the atmosphere at school was different. Something had changed, as if the quiet echo of Lena's letter still hung in the air. Students who had previously spent their breaks in groups, mocking others, suddenly fell silent at the sight of the lonely people. The words they had so easily thrown out in anger now bounced off the walls with a strange weight. Lena came to school in the same uniform. It was still torn, though someone had sewn a new button on it. She was holding a notebook, not a letter, but her step was different, calmer, stronger. In the hallway, a girl from her class approached her. They had never spoken before. "Hi, do you want to sit with me during the break?" Lena looked at her in disbelief. She nodded. For her, this wasn't just a proposal. It was the first gesture of normality. With each passing hour, the children stopped whispering, not because they had forgotten, but because they had begun to listen to each other, to listen to their teachers, to listen to those who had previously been invisible. During a Polish language lesson, the teacher asked the students to write a few sentences about what it means to be human. Usually, such an assignment ended in platitudes. But that day, they created texts that could embarrass adults, because the children who were laughing at us were now listening, and that was the most beautiful lesson the school could give. A few days after the roll call, the principal received a letter. But this time, it wasn't from a student. It was an elegant envelope, stamped with the city education department's seal. Inside was an official document and a personal letter from the education superintendent himself. They read Lena's letter. Someone, probably one of the teachers deeply moved, forwarded it as an example of how schools should respond to crises and how children can speak up without shouting. The curator wrote, "This letter moved us to tears. It is not only a testament to courage but also a warning. As an educational institution, we need to see more than the results in the journal. That is why we come to visit." The school began preparations, but this time it wasn't just a simple cleanup. The teachers weren't telling the kids to behave nicely just because there were guests. This time, it was more than that, because when the education authorities visited them, instead of empty words, they heard stories of transformation from the students, about how one sentence in a letter, "I only want one thing, to be treated like a human being," became the motto of the new school. Lena didn't have to say anything. She was sitting in the front row, next to the principal, wearing a new simple uniform that the parents of one of the students had sewn for her. The letter reached further than anyone expected, but above all, it reached where it needed to be, in people's hearts. The school's birthday was approaching, an annual celebration full of performances, cakes, and colorful decorations. Students were asked to bring symbolic gifts, drawings, poems, handmade trinkets. Usually the children competed to see who would bring something more spectacular. On this day, however, something was different. Most students had forgotten. Some had decided it was unimportant. The halls were decorated, but there was no emotion. Teachers noticed a colder mood, as if the holiday had lost its significance. And then Lena came to the secretary's office. In her hands, she held a folded, simple package wrapped in newspaper. She approached the secretary timidly and said, "It's for school, for my birthday." The woman took the package and opened it delicately. Inside was a piece of an old wooden tablet with burnt letters. "School is not just a building. It is a place where the heart learns to love." Underneath she wrote in pen, "Lena." The secretary was speechless. It wasn't a decoration. It wasn't a colorful poster. But no one, absolutely no one, had brought anything as moving. The principal ordered a sign to be hung at the entrance, where hundreds of students pass it every day. And that was when the school again felt what true value was. Not in quantity, not in appearance, but in intention, in the heart, in the word. A few days after the school birthday party, the principal decided to organize a meeting with parents. Not about grades, not about behavioral problems, but to talk about empathy, respect, and the story of one girl. The turnout was high. Many parents came out of curiosity, some reluctantly, treating it as a duty. The gym was filled with people again, but this time it wasn't children sitting on benches. It was adults listening. The director came to the center and took the letter in her hand. "Today I will read to you the same text that I read to your children last week. I want you to know what they know, and what has changed them." The words rang out again, each one a blow to the conscience. But this time the audience was not defenseless and not blameless. Many of these parents passed Lena in the hallways every day. They saw her clothes, they heard the comments, and they never reacted. There was silence, the same as during roll call. But then, there was a murmur. One of the mothers, known for being the chairwoman of the Parents' Council, stood up and approached the principal. "Please, can we meet her? Can I say sorry to her? As a mother?" Tears appeared on many faces. Some fathers sat with their heads down. Others tried to hide their emotions but couldn't. This was no ordinary meeting. It was a mirror in which parents saw themselves, through the eyes of a child. After the meeting, which ended in tears and reflection, many parents approached the principal with one question: "What can we do to help?" They did not ask out of obligation. They asked out of need. Need for redress. Need to fix what had been ignored for years. The principal didn't have a ready plan, but the answer came by itself. The next day, Lena brought another letter to school, but this time, not to teachers or to peers. This letter was for adults. "I don't want money. I don't want gifts. I want every child who will be like me someday not to have to write a letter like that. I want them to see it before and understand." This letter was read on the school website. Then it was shared by a parent on social media. And again, like the first letter, it spread like wildfire. The comments were full of words. "I have never cried during the school fast. This girl has more courage than entire generations of adults. We should learn from her, not the other way around." In response, the school launched the Child's Voice program. Once a month, one child could anonymously or openly write what they felt, what they experienced, what they needed. All letters were to be read publicly, by adults. And that was a revolution, because for the first time, adults listened to children. And for the first time, children believed that their voices meant something. And it all started with one poor girl, and one simple question: "Can I be treated like a human being?" The end of the school year was approaching. Traditionally, a performance was organized, loud, colorful, full of music and laughter. This time, however, a different proposal was made. One of the students, who had not distinguished himself with activity before, raised his hand at a class meeting and said, "How about this year we do something quieter, something that speaks without words?" At first, the teachers didn't understand, but the students quickly caught on. They created a project called Festival of Silence. There was no dialogue on stage, just movement, images, and light. In the background, fragments of letters were read, not only Lena's but also those of other children who had dared to write thanks to her. Each performance ended with one common scene. All the children stood next to each other and held cards with the words, "I see you. I hear you. You are important." Lena wasn't performing. She was sitting in the front row. Next to her was the teacher who had once refused to read her letter. Now, she was holding her hand. When the lights went down, there was no applause. There was silence. But it was the most beautiful silence the school had ever heard. Weeks passed, then months. But something lingered. Something deeper than momentary emotion. A new space was created in the school, the empathy room. A place where students could come, sit, be silent, or talk, without judgment, without rushing, without having to be okay. Teachers began to conduct lessons that ended not with a test, but with a conversation. Parents who used to come only to meetings now came to the school to help with initiatives. Joint breakfasts, sewing workshops, charity collections were organized. But the biggest change was Lena herself. Not because she became popular, not because she suddenly had new friends, but because she no longer had to be silent. She began writing. Not letters, but stories. Her Polish teacher asked her to read one of them at graduation. It was about a girl who came in a torn uniform and changed the world without raising her voice. No one had to ask who the girl was. At the end of the year, When all the students and parents gathered on the playground, the principal walked to the center and looked at the faces she knew, not only by name but already from history. We have learned more this year than in any previous year, not from textbooks, but from one letter. And then she asked Lena to come to the microphone. The girl approached, slowly, calmly, without stage fright. She looked at the crowd and said one sentence, the same one she once wrote with a shaking hand while sitting in a cold room. "I don't want pity. I want to be treated like a human being." And that was enough. The whole school stood up, not to applaud, but to bear witness, to confirm that they hear, that they see, that they understand. Since that day, a board with that sentence has hung on the wall of the main corridor. Next to it, a photo of Lena in a torn uniform, not to humiliate her, but to remind her. Every day, every class, because some lessons are too important to forget.